Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the presentation of the report of the Media Freedom Rapid Response Mission on the safety of journalists here in the Netherlands. This press conference will be done in English because the mission was conducted by an international coalition, and we also have an international audience, mainly online. Media Freedom Rapid Response is a consortium of 6 European media and press freedom organizations. I will all name them. So we start with the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, the European Federation of Journalists, Article 19, International Press Institute, the Osservatorio Balconi e Qualcosa Transeuropa, Italian, and Free Press Unlimited. The Media Freedom Rapid Response is funded by the European Commission, and its objective is to give legal and practical support to journalists in the member countries and candidate countries of the Union. The consortium monitors press freedom in these countries and undertakes also advocacy to strive for more and better press freedom and the safety of journalists. The MFRR already conducted several missions in other countries, so the Netherlands is not the first. Other countries where the mission was taking place was Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, Italy, and Serbia. So now you might ask, why the Netherlands? Because the Netherlands, of course, has a very good reputation when it comes to the safety of journalists. It is known as a front fighter for press freedom. And internationally, it stands for a safe haven for journalists. And a well-known new initiative called Persveilig, which is actually an agreement between the Dutch Association of Journalists, the Dutch Society of Editors-in-Chief, and on the other side, the police and the public prosecution, has also a very good name internationally. So why then a mission here in the Netherlands? Because sadly, despite being a front fighter for press freedom, here in the Netherlands we also face increasingly violations and a hostile climate against journalists. We all remember the decision of the Dutch public broadcaster to remove the logos from their transportation vehicles, right? To actually protect their employees. And of course, we remember the horrible murder on the Dutch crime journalist Peter R. de Vries on broad daylight. But we also see an increasingly violation against journalists during demonstrations, even peaceful demonstrations. Persveilig also monitors a lot of these alerts. And in 2021, they filed 270 alerts. Intimidation, violation, harassment, all against journalists. That number was in 2020 only 121. So there's a steep increase. And the question is, of course, why? Why is the safety of journalists here in the Netherlands declining in practice? Because on paper, we have such a strong safety mechanism, like Persveilig. To find that answer, that was the reason why we, Free Press Unlimited, initiated this fact-finding mission in the Netherlands. We did that in a very close consultation with the Dutch Association of Journalists. And as soon as we announced this, we got a lot of reactions. There's a huge interest for this. For this particular mission, we interviewed a wide range of stakeholders, varying from, of course, journalists and editors-in-chief, but also policymakers, member of parliaments, and of course the coordinator of Persveilig. And the results of the investigation are to be found in this report, which will be presented in just a couple of minutes. And the report is named Spotlight on safety, advancing protection for journalists amidst rising threats here in the Netherlands. The report, or the main results of the report, will be presented by Laurens Hutting from the European Centre of Press and Media Freedom and Guusje Zomer of Free Press Unlimited. And after their presentation, there will be two panels who will go into the recommendations of the report. One will look into the prevention and strategies with a specific gender lens, and the other panel will go into the protection of journalists. I hope that you have a very interesting afternoon, and I wish you all the best. Guusje and Laurens, can I give you the floor? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruud. And thank you all for being here to start with. A real thank you, because I think the fact that we are here today with such a wide range of actors, ranging from the policymakers, politicians, to, of course, the journalistic community, editors-in-chief, but also law enforcement and academic experts, is really something that should not be taken for granted, especially when looking at what is happening in Russia today, for instance, where journalists are, of course, there is no journalism left. A meeting that we are having today would be absolutely impossible, and that's an understatement, I think. So to start with, thank you for showing up today and for showing your support for the safety of journalists in the Netherlands. In this regard, I think the Netherlands is clearly a very safe haven for journalists. That being said, let us now zoom into the safety of journalists in the Netherlands. So at the center of the Dutch policy regarding safety of journalists is persveilig, or in English, press safe. I think for the audience here in the room, this is already quite known, but we also have an international audience online. So just to briefly explain, persveilig is a safety mechanism including several protocols, national action plans and guidelines. And it was established in 2019 by the National Police, as Ruud said, the Dutch Journalists Union, the Association of Editors-in-Chief, and the Public Prosecution Office. And it is co-funded by several ministries of the Dutch government. So in that regard, persveilig is a very unique safety mechanism that's also internationally often praised. So to begin with, in our report, what we found is that the symbolic value of persveilig is very high. So an example is the persveilig hotline, where journalists who are faced with harassment, intimidation, violence, and other forms of press freedom violations can file a report. And this gives a very clear signal to society that no press freedom violation should ever be accepted in the Netherlands, and also that this is not part of the job of journalists. But this hotline also means that data are collected at a central point, and that press freedom violations in the Netherlands are now being monitored consistently. So this has shown an increase in the past year, for instance, of threats against journalists. And we see that this has clearly led to more awareness on the policy level. And in that sense, we conclude in our report that persveilig has really strengthened the voice of journalists towards the authorities. But of course, persveilig also leads to more practical improvements of safety of journalists on the ground. So in the mission, in the meetings that we had as part of the mission, what came forward very often was the example of the safety trainings that are offered by persveilig. So these are basically trainings offered to reporters, journalists, but also photographers, and also offered to freelancers for free, to basically prepare them for the potential violence that they may face while reporting, for instance, on demonstrations. So it is a way to make them more resilient and to teach them coping strategies. And this in our mission really came forward as one of the well, it's very much appreciated by the journalistic community, and also serves as an example for other countries, we think. But at the same time, we're of course not here today just to praise persveilig, but we also need to zoom out a bit and look at room for improvement, of course, in the Dutch, generally in the Dutch policy regarding safety of journalists. And we're also here today to provide some recommendations. And despite the persveilig efforts, we cannot ignore the fact that, as Ruud also said, threats and aggression against journalists are and remain on the rise in the Netherlands. So this, in fact, has led us to believe that prosecuting the aggressors of journalists and at the same time improving coping strategies of journalists to deal with harassment that they face is just simply not enough. So to remain an international pioneer, the Netherlands really need to do more about preventing these threats against journalists. And the Netherlands need to do more in order to address the root causes underlying such threats and such aggression. So first, this will, we think, require more investigation, more research into the motives that people hold. Like, why do people harass journalists? Why do people think it is okay to throw eggs at reporters at demonstrations? What are the underlying root causes? And I think following from that, policy is needed to improve the position of journalists in the Dutch society and to really strengthen their role and also the perception of the role of journalists as a fourth pillar in our democracy. That's why we recommend to the Dutch authorities, in particular the Ministry of Education, Culture and Justice, to explore this option further. And we hope that today, the first panel of today will be a first exploration of that recommendation. But first, Lawrence will share a bit more.
Thanks, Guusje. So I'll address 4 further key action points that came out of our fact-finding. They are firstly about gender, secondly the need for advancing tailor-made protection options to tackle threats coming from organized crime. The third one is about policing protest, and lastly also the need to preserve and expand the capacity of Persveilig. So the first action point concerns the need for specific policies that will improve the safety of women journalists. Throughout the mission, we heard from our interlocutors that women journalists face specific types of threats and are also more frequently subjected to attacks in specific contexts, online context being an important one here. The Netherlands, in other words, is no exception to European and global trends in this regard. At the same time, establishing the scope and the intensity of the problem here in the Netherlands proved challenging, as there is currently no systemic monitoring mechanism that tracks this gendered and gender-based violence and harassment. We're concerned about this blind spot. First, because there is a blind spot and that's a problem in se, but also because of the impact or the implication that having this blind spot has on the development of policies. Creating solutions that work, after all, really requires a precise understanding of the problem. And so that's why one of our recommendations is that monitoring of attacks and harassment of women journalists specifically should be strengthened. One possible solution could be to integrate this into Persveilig's alert mechanism, which at the moment does not collect data about the gender of the affected journalist. The second action point concerns the need to accelerate the development of tailor-made protection for journalists who face threats coming from organized crime. We heard during the mission that the threat from the underworld must be taken more seriously and that the current approach is too naive. The word kinderachtig or childish came up repeatedly during our interviews. At the same time, it's clear that not all journalists who face the same or similar threats either require or want the same format and the same type of protection. So there needs to be a move away from a cookie-cutter approach into something that is tailored and fits each journalist's individual situation. In any case, whatever the shape that this protection then takes, it must allow a reporter to continue working, which, especially for crime journalists, a key point here is the protection of their sources, as they are in contact with people who may not be too keen on that meeting being joined by a police officer as well, for example. Thirdly, I wanted to briefly address the interaction between reporters and police during protests. Many journalists told us that in recent years, tension has increased. This is despite a very high willingness for cooperation between the various actors. But nevertheless, there remains a need to ensure a better understanding of the role of the press during demonstrations. At the moment, our understanding is that a lack of capacity seems to be part of the explanation of the problem. This increased understanding then should also translate into changes to operational procedures with a view to minimizing interference and obstruction of reporting during demonstrations. This ought to include, among other things, improvement of the practice around the recognition of the press card. Lastly, the final action point I wanted to raise before handing it over to our panelists is the capacity of Pijsveilig. With this mechanism, the Netherlands has really created a rare gem of best practice if you look at the European context. And so now it's important to keep this European leadership, as Guusje also mentioned. So with that in mind, the Media Freedom Rapid Response recommends further investment in this mechanism and in its resources. This should include the full financing of the mechanism in the post-subsidy era, and also an expansion of its human capital, its human resources, so that the mechanism can respond on the one hand to the increase in threats that are currently within its scope, but also can broaden that scope to include, for example, a gender lens, or to invest more in prevention. I'll keep it at this and hand it over to our moderator.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So it is now time to dive a little deeper into some of the recommendations that we just heard. And we will do that through two panels. As Ruth briefly mentioned, the first panel will focus on prevention strategies of women journalists, and the second panel will focus on the safety of journalists during demonstrations and in the context of organized crime. My name is Flora Schulte-Noordholt, and I will be moderating both panels. I'd like to invite the first panel up on stage, Ingrid and Rowan. While you're walking up, I will briefly introduce who I have with me here on stage. Rowan Blijt. Oh, introducing each other. Rowan Blijt, program maker for KRO NCRV and founder of the Glow Up. Welcome. And Ingrid Michon, Dutch member of parliament of the VVD party and spokesperson on justice and security. We had a third panelist who unfortunately was sick today from the Ministry of Education, but I'm certain that we will have enough valuable insights with these two panelists today. So welcome. I have some questions for us to start off the discussion. And after that, at the end of this panel, there will be room for questions from the audience. So I'd like to ask you to save your questions till the end, please. And for those watching through live stream, you can pose your questions in the chat and we will get to those at the end as well. Rowan, let's start with you. One of the findings from the report is that women journalists in the Netherlands face more threats and violence than their male colleagues, especially online. You are a female journalist. Do you agree? Is this something that you experience as well?
I wholeheartedly agree. The thing is that it always was a feeling, or I heard my other female colleagues talk about the threats that they receive. But I'm glad that we're now getting to the step that we are going to collect data to back that feeling up. So I wholeheartedly agree that we as female journalists have a very hard time doing our jobs because we get critiqued for not only doing our jobs, but also for who we are or where we are from. So it gets very personal very easily.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that that it's good to know you didn't just imagine it.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna have one follow-up question for you. What are the effects of this violence in your work? Do you self-censor, for example, or how does it affect your day-to-day work?
For me, for example, I back in 2017 have received a lot of threats for something very I thought it was very fun and lighthearted. But for me personally, when I received those threats and all those messages, I really thought about the possibility of possibly leaving this job and do something else, or not be on the forefront as much, or not tell the stories that I'm used to tell. So that was it for me.
That's a huge effect for a journalist, of course. Ingrid, question for you. So next to specific recommendations on safety of women journalists, prevention was also a big theme in the report that needed improvement in the Netherlands. And we know that the VVD puts a quite strong emphasis on prosecution and stronger punishment. What is the vision of the VVD in terms of prevention?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's a very interesting afternoon and a good initiative. And I think that prevention and the prosecution has to be it's both sides on one medal. So you can't only focus on prevention without sort of keeping the door closed. So we did a lot of initiatives. Like there's one initiative called doxing. That's a new law which tries to sort of copes with threatening on the internet. So like if you example see your name or you see your address, it can be very threatening to put it online. But of course, prevention, in my point of view, starts with sort of drawing the line. Even in Parliament, where I am, if you see my colleagues talking about mainstream media, or they're sort of encouraging people who are not dealing with the law we got here, then I think it's very important as a member of Parliament that you stand up and you speak out for our journalists, and that's what we do as a VVD.
Yeah, drawing the line and pinpointing what it is that we're dealing with is super important, of course. Do you link that to some sort of education programs in terms of prevention?
Well, for me, journalism is a very important pillar on the whole house we build in Holland on our democracy and our rule of law. So in that way, yes, of course, it is education. We got like it's very important to be careful with the institutions we have. And I think journalism is a very important sort of institution in the whole house of democracy, in the whole house of rule of law that we got here in this country. And yeah, in that way, it's of course it starts with education. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And just to stay with you for one follow-up question, specifically because we're talking about women journalists here, do you have policy or policy ideas to better protect women journalists specifically?
Actually, no. That's I heard this today in this report, and it's very important to set the agenda, and to hear it from you. And as a female politician, I think, I think we got some same experiences. So I think it's very important to set the agenda and to see what's specially needed for female journalists. I even think that there are not so many female journalists, are there?
Oh,
Much
no, there
more
are.
male.
No, there are lots of female journalists, women journalists. Yes, there are. And that's why I also think that in that respect that we really need to monitor the data and we really need to count and not count women out, because that's what we have been doing for a long time. And also not count their experiences out as well.
That's definitely true. And I think now that there's so much attention on like being a woman and the gender-based aspect of violence, as you say, Ingrid, politicians and journalists are quite close to each other. They're both in the spotlight, both quite vulnerable. So it's good to address that group as such. Rowan, you are hearing just now in the recommendations by Guusje and Laurens, and right now in this conversation, quite some recommendations and ideas about you and your work. Hearing this, do you think this will help, or?
Yes, of course. No, I really do think the 4 points that were already made do help, and I do hope that we can stick to it, that we can keep it top of mind as well. And my thing really is to to monitor the data, to have some data, to have something to grasp, to inform policies, to inform research, further research. I mean, so I agree with what has already been said.
Yeah, a lack of data is of course a huge issue. So it's good that that's a recommendation in the report. Ingrid, to ask you a follow-up question. What do you think is the responsibility of other stakeholders? So we're talking about journalists here, but as you said, you have the doxing law, and platforms are involved there. Newsrooms are involved. They probably have a duty of care for their journalists. Where does the responsibility lie towards other stakeholders, do you feel?
Like others
So
than you just
the
mentioned.
platforms. What do you feel that platforms, for example, should?
Okay.
Do you feel they have a responsibility in this regard?
Well, I think it's a common responsibility because this problem is much bigger than you can cope alone. And as a journalist, the community of journalists cannot do it alone. So I think that's why Persveilig, they stood up. That's why members of parliaments and also, of course, the ministries, they sort of want to cooperate with Persveilig, and they want to, they want to fund it. And I think that's a very good initiative because then there you see problems in a whole, so not like divided, but the whole problem. And I think it's very important that Persveilig, that's one of the action as well, that Persveilig will continue and will maybe increase also their attention, for example, for female journalism, because that's the beginning of the discussion. And the discussion then starts not only in parliament, but also just in society and on the ministries, like, what do we think is normal? What is needed to protect our journalists? And that can be, like, as a member of parliament, it's always about, well, sort of measures to protect them. For example, the funding. We do it with Persveilig, the funding. So every journalist who has not an employer can follow courses, or they can have a red button to protect themselves. So that's like small measures to make their work in a safer environment. But it's like so much more. So I think it's very important to cooperate and to do it together with every stakeholder. Because I think in society and in parliament and on the ministries, everybody agrees that we have to be very careful and we have to stand up for our journalists. So in that way, there's not much difference of understanding.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and we need a multi-stakeholder approach, is what I'm hearing in your answer, definitely. I'm seeing some questions coming through the chat, which is a nice bridge for a question to you, Rowan. Journalists themselves, of course, are also stakeholder here. So what do you think is the role of journalism or a journalist itself to protect specifically women journalists in this case?
They have a very big role to have this infrastructure or a safety net available for their own journalists that might have some harassment issues coming towards them. For example, when I faced my sort of harassment back in 2017, it was very hard for me to find the right path within the company to see who could help me, who could support me. The main reaction that I got from colleagues was, it's part of the job. That's just what happens. And that wasn't enough for me. So what happened afterwards for me was that I joined the Association of Journalists. So that was what I did. But I think that the public broadcasting system that we have, that there are lots of steps available. For example, in other countries, they also have examples ready for what you can do to support your journalists. I think a safety net in the form of even asking, how are you? How is this affecting you? That's a small step that you could even undertake. But there are lots of other things that they can do. And I think it's very important to realize, as a broadcaster, for example, I'm using my own example, to realize the role that you have in supporting your own journalists. And I hope that with everything that's happening right now, that the realization is there right now. That's what I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, so this attitude of it's part of the job,
Yeah.
that's of course a deeper rooted issue. It's a more systemic issue that we need a culture change in some way
Exactly.
to view positions of journalists.
Yes.
Just one follow-up question about this network that you're talking about. Do you feel supported enough by existing networks, or do you feel that there really is an area of improvement there for a whole new network to be set up?
I think there is room for how do you say that, for an extra network, you could say. I think our approach has been very broad in the Netherlands. It has been very we can help journalists as a whole, but as we already heard before, we really need some gender-based studies and a gender-based approach for women journalists in this example, because they get a different type of threats than male journalists get. So I really think that if I think of my own examples, if I think of the friends I have that work in journalism, the approach that we need is very different towards us than towards men. And
Yeah.
I think there's a whole lot of work to do in that aspect still.
Yeah, recognizing these attacks as gender-based, there's a huge gender component because the attacks are often, same as politicians, sexual, misogynistic, and it really needs to be recognized as such. Ingrid, did you want to respond just
Yeah,
now?
well-
After that, I'm going to look to the audience if there are any questions left.
I think it's, of course, it's important to tell about it in your own company, and you have your boss, you have an employer, but there are a lot of journalists, freelancers, and they are on their own. So I think for that specific group, then Persveilig, but also like every police region got his own single point of contact, especially for journalists who are threatened, who are dealing with harassment. So I think. Even for the freelance journalism, they can feel more sort of in isolation and more alone. Even people working
But yeah, company, product,
company, yeah.
public broadcaster. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. This group of freelancers as extra vulnerable
Yeah.
actually to these attacks. Yeah. I'm looking at the time and looking into the audience. Are there any questions here from this group? No. Then I think in terms of time, it goes very fast. We're going to need to round off unless one of you has a last remark to
I think
make to round off.
one last thing that I really want to point out is that for in gender-based violence in politics, in media, in whatever, I think it's also very important in legislation. I mean, that the correct training is available as well for officers, for lawyers, for example, because what we see in gender-based violence as a whole is that it's very hard sometimes for women to step up and to say what's happening. So I would also suggest looking at that.
Yes,
Yeah.
strong point to end
Yes.
this panel
Yeah.
with, I think. Thank you both so much for joining us today here. Thank you. And I'd like to invite the second panel up, but perhaps first a round of applause for this panel. Thank you. The second panel, while you walk up here, I will introduce you. So in this second panel, we will focus on another major theme in the report, the safety of journalists during demonstrations and in the context of organized crime. And with us here today, we have, starting on my right, your left, Paul Vugts, investigative crime journalist for Het Parool. We have Thomas Bruning, General Secretary from the Dutch Association of Journalists, and we have Peije de Meij, Head of Operations at the Dutch Police. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Paul, I'll start with you. So the murder of Peter R. de Vries sparked a nationwide discussion on the safety of journalists and more specifically on personal protection of journalists. And one of the recommendations in the report was this tailor-made personal protection. And given your experience with personal protection, what is your view on this
I think it's
issue and
very
recommendation?
important because the protection being tailor-made is the most important about the whole complex of protection. I've been they planned to kill me in 2017, and I've been in the best protection we have in Holland, the Royal Diplomatic Security Service, Dienst Koninklijke en Diplomatieke Beveiliging. That's top of the bill. So we lived in a safe house, my girlfriend and I was with them. They protected me to all the places where we went. But if you get one step lower or aside, whatever you would call it, it's gonna be more critical, because if my tailor-made package was 100% the way I wanted it to have it, because the person I dealt with, I spoke with, always the same person. We were absolutely, we shared thoughts, and that is a big issue in some other parts of the Netherlands, and it's a big issue that as the higher you get into to The Hague, the distance is too wide. It's too long. You need someone really close to you. So I live in Amsterdam. I really needed someone in Amsterdam who I can talk to, who I can go to, who I can meet whenever I want. And once I need to go from Amsterdam to The Hague, to, for example, NCTV, the contra-terror organization who gets involved, that distance is too long. You are not on speaking terms with the same persons the whole day, the whole week, and that's very important.
So, sorry, just to clarify for those who are not very into this matter, you mean the higher in The Hague, so the higher up in hierarchy, for example,
Yes.
at the NCTV?
Yes.
And you had good personal protection because of the proximity?
Short distance.
Yeah, proximity, okay. And why did you get this personal protection? And what made your case special to
One
say?
specific crime group wanted to kill me, and it was the information was very specific. And if I wouldn't have been in protection, I wouldn't have lived. So that was very specific. My colleague John van der Heuvel, working for the Telegraaf, as everybody knows, he's in the same kind of protection from December 2017 up until now. We have lawyers in the same kind of protection, unfortunately. And we have prosecutors and judges being secured that way. So that's the new reality we need to face. And I don't want anybody to say it's not Dutch way of living. It's the Dutch threat. It's a threat for us in Holland as well. It's not Italy, it's us.
Yeah, it's the reality.
It's
in the
our
Netherlands
reality
now.
daily.
One quick follow-up question before I move on to the next panelist. Personal protection, of course, requires a careful balance between journalistic freedoms on the one hand and safety on the other hand, which is always kind of the clash, right?
Yes.
So how do you think this balance is best protected?
In my personal story, it was the only group I could not meet easily was the criminals themselves, because the security service wouldn't bring me to them because to me. But I need
Good
them
call,
as sources.
probably.
I need, but I still need them as sources. I need to be able to speak to everybody. So that was that we had work to do. I was the first journalist in Holland in this protection program. So we were pioneers in that, and we found out. I can't tell how, but we found a way to do it. But in general, the Royal and Diplomatic Security Service made it possible for me to meet whoever I want to meet. You have no privacy. You have no your agenda needs to be on their side 4 days before. So you have no. It's not an easy way of living, but they made it possible for me to do my job.
Good. Yeah, so it really seems there is an added value to this tailor-made personal protection, as you say.
It's crucial.
Yeah. Thank you. Thomas, I have a question for you. Persveilig, of which you are on the steering committee, is the mechanism in the Netherlands when it comes to the safety of journalists, and the demand is high. At the same time, the ministry has announced that it will stop its funding per 2024, if I'm correct. So a more general question for you, what does the future of Persveilig look like? Where do you see Persveilig in 5 years?
Well, I'm happy with this meeting, and I'm also happy with this sort of positive European audit of what we're doing with Persveilig until now. And but to be honest, the point you're making is giving us some sort of worry, because as we experienced until now, it's crucial at one hand that the sector itself, the media companies, the public broadcaster, and the commercial broadcasters are joining forces also in a giving financial means to support Persveilig. But we also experience that it's really necessary to have a public support as well. And what we emphasized the last few years, and happily the members of parliament and the ministers supported this as well, is that we said, if you want to do a project like this, you need a sort of structural base. Otherwise it becomes a project, and you have to send away the people involved with it after 3 years or 2 years, and you get this whole system again. And our experiences with other types of, let's say, things that the media party should do together, like the ethical council, has given us reason to not only be positive about the support, the serious financial support from the sector itself. So until now, especially the public broadcaster showed that they want to invest, but it's also a little bit due to the fact that one of the other members of the steering committee of Persveilig is Marcel Gelauw, who's in the room here and who has good connections to the public broadcaster. But we experienced, for instance, that the media companies, let's say more the publishing side, have showed some. We had to convince them really about this project, and I think we need to sort of join forces to continue this project, because it won't go away from itself. And,
So you can rely on some sort of support from the sector itself. That's good to hear. And we can expect Persveilig to not vanish in 5 years if all goes well. I do have a question. So you're talking about this financial support from the sector. From the sector itself, do you think, and this is a question that also came in, by the way, do you think there's a role or responsibility for journalists themselves in terms of their own safety? And if so, what do you think that is?
well, definitely. And one of the things I thought could also be a recommendation would be this, let's say, unstable position of freelance journalists here in Holland. Because I think, and I've said it here in the parliament as well, in earlier meetings, that that to be a professional journalist, you have to have the means also yourself to protect yourself. And one of the outcomes, what we see, and I think it was mentioned in the report as well, is that, for instance, photojournalists or freelance journalists, although they get offered these trainings for free, and these trainings usually would cost 500-600 euros a day, they still would cancel in the last moment, because they say, okay, we can earn 300 euros today, so we won't do it because we need the money. And this is only one example. And one of the others is, of course, that usually freelancers aren't able to hire a special place to work. So they're working from out of their house, which makes them also more vulnerable. And the same goes for, let's say, the bulletproof vest or other sources of protection. It's quite worrisome if you have to think about these things. And at the same time being a professional. And last week we were in another, we were at the court, because and we also mentioned this problem, because, for instance, photographers, they work not on an hourly base for media companies, but they work on a basis of giving them per photo. They get paid per photo. But if you go to some tense demonstration or some places where you have to invest first to be safe, You have to place your car not directly on the
Yeah.
demonstration. You have to. It would be much more better not to bring your camera directly, so you can connect with the people and see how your position is. But if you get paid by photo, it's not easy to make
Yeah.
this decision because you have to do it in your own time.
So thank you. I'm hearing these struggles or these issues around freelance journalists. Beye, I want to ask you a question, but I want to give Paul one chance to react to the freelance issue, if you like.
Same as
I heard
Thomas,
you.
I've been stressing this point for years now because I work for a big publishing company, so from my costs were paid very well without hesitating. But my colleagues who work freelance, they sometimes need to think twice or longer if they are gonna put one or another story out because with the risk of being harassed or even killed or accused in court and need to pay a lawyer. And this chilling effect is a big danger to the freedom of press.
Yeah, this it is a vulnerable group, what we heard in the first panel, and now it's reiterated again. Beye, to include you in the conversation now. One of the recommendations in the report is that there's more need for police capacity. And what do you think is needed to better implement the persveilig protocol within the police?
Yeah, every problem in the world, the answer is more police.
It's not.
Well,
So, but I think we're always short on budget and policemen, of course. But I think it's a very serious problem that we have here on our hands. And I think the report and also this conversation that realize the police that we have to do more than we do now. I think persveilig is a very good start because we all in this room realize and we experience all these attacks. It's indeed a fact of life now. There's science, members of parliament, journalists, and also policemen. They are attacked in their work. And it's not acceptable. So I think the most important statement that we have to make here is society should not accept this.
Yeah.
And of course, we are, as a police, the last resort, but we are not the solution to every problem. And I think in persveilig, there is an understanding that journalists first have to protect themselves, the companies are responsible, and there is a last resort, and that's the police. And I think it's very important as a nation, a democratic nation, that we support journalists to do their work. I think it's very important. And for that case, we not only more police capacity, but we have to give priority to this matter. So we cannot do investigation to all the crimes that there are, but this is a specific group and we have to give priority. So I think that is important.
Yeah, no, I hear you and I agree. I do hear the need for prevention measures as well in your answer. Just to zoom in on one more practical approach, which we were just discussing, this tailor-made protection. From a police point of view, do you expect to put this in practice more? Is that feasible, this recommendation from the report?
Yeah, I think it's good to talk about it. We have this single point of contact in every region. My colleague Wim Hoonhout is also here, and he talks on a frequently basis with the journalists. So what do you experience? What are the specific problems? And I think in the one region, it's another case. Because Paul, he's on the top level of threatening, but we're happy that in the Netherlands, luckily most journalists don't experience that kind of threat. So it's important not only that single point of contact and the network, but it's also important that when you call the police,
You feel protected, or
that every policeman will act.
Yeah.
Not only one person in the region, but every policeman, when you call the police, they act on a good way and they give priority.
Do you feel there's an urgency within the police to that understands the role of journalists in society? Do you feel there's enough understanding in the police to?
I think it can be better. It's growing, but it can be better.
Okay, okay, thank
I
you.
agree on that. There are still police stations where it's hard to
Yeah,
to tell your story as a journalist.
Yeah, you-
Not my story because that's not a spectrum, but the story of
your colleagues.
a colleague being harassed online and trying to discuss it and being sent away. Then of course we call persveilig and we'll find our way.
Yeah.
But it should be more in the roots of the police.
Yeah.
Do you feel Persveilig is a platform where serves as the basis for this dialogue, or do you feel that there needs to be more invested in strengthening this dialogue between journalists and the police?
I think
I'm looking at
Persveilig,
any of you two
yeah,
who want to.
Persveilig is a good brand, so
Yeah.
we have to keep that up. Not only for a few years as a project, but on long term. So that's important. But we have 65,000 policemen, so
Yeah.
we have to do more about the awareness that journalists are threatened.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I think that Persveilig can be a good basis for having these contacts. Because what you're explaining, of course, and I can understand it. I mean, when you have 60,000 people working at an organization, you can't expect them all to be informed in the right way, and that's the reason that these single points of contact are so important. So you can directly go to the better level to address the case when something goes wrong. And
Yeah.
what we saw last year is also because we have with the steering committee, we are every three months or something, we're checking on the also on the data, what we get in as problems, and also the reports at the police. And what we saw last year, which is good, is that there were almost as much reports at the police as there were at Persveilig, which means that the police found out, have placed it in the right basket, so to say.
Are following up on these.
Yeah, so they recognize it as journalists going to the police station.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things that comes out that is
Yeah.
positive.
Well, I mean, yeah, it underlines that Persveilig, of course, is a best practice in the international context for a good reason. It's good we have this base in the Netherlands. Looking at the time, I'm going to look into the audience if there are any questions here. No, I see one coming in online, which is a follow-up question to all of you. The Netherlands serves as a good practice. When advising other states on their measures to improve the safety of journalists, what recommendation would you give based on Persveilig? So the way I hear that question is if other
Well,
countries want to implement Persveilig,
Yeah. Well, what
what
I
would you-
did, because we have also, we're in good contact with our European affiliates, and also, for instance, Belgium was so inspired by what we're doing right here that they already made the step to put persveilig.be online. So they're just starting it. But what I advised them was you first have to start with a good research among the journalists themselves, because we did so for several years, and every 6 years or something we went to our members and we checked on them. But the big difference was when Brenninkmeijer and Oudekerke back in 2019 really did a good research, and then it was really put high on the agenda, also politically. So I think if you want to start somewhere, you really have to have a good research, because you also make clear to the journalists themselves that they, as Rowan said before, that you should not take it for granted or something, but you should speak out about it, and you should do something about it, and you should involve your editors-in-chief and the management in this. So I think training, research, and getting the managers involved is very important, alongside with the police and
Yeah, good. Thank
I
you.
think the
And
awareness is crucial. Awareness of the problem
Awareness,
is crucial.
yeah.
And the horrible fact that Peter R. de Vries has been killed last summer, the horrible fact that Martin Kok, crime blogger, has been killed, and the lawyer of Crown Witness and the brother of a Crown Witness, and the newsrooms of the Telegraaf and Panorama have been attacked. Those horrible facts make sure that for 1 to 3 months it's on top of everybody's minds, and then it fades away.
Yeah.
And that should not happen. And if I may make one more statement, the courtrooms, the extra secured courtrooms, are very well protected, but not for journalists outside, and not for lawyers lawyers who need to go there. And we tried to stress this for a long time, and now we got 10 email addresses of the 10 courts. If we have any questions, we can email. That's not the solution for this.
No, and I'm going to look at Paye. Is that something you want to react to? This need for
But it's
what
not
you're
only the
saying.
police. It's not the problem
No.
of the police.
No, that's
a
my
reaction.
Yeah, that's my statement. The first thing is that hands off the journalists. We must influence the public opinion. You don't attack journalists, and
Prevention,
then comes the police
Yeah.
at the end.
And the populist politicians should stop poisoning the debate.
Yeah.
The atmosphere around
This is,
journalists.
of course, the need, what's in the report as well about this prevention and this need for a culture shift to recognize the role of journalists in society. I have one last question, and then I think we have to round off because I'm not seeing any hands in the audience. We've spoken about different measures to protect journalists, but what is the first priority now to improve the safety of journalists? According to crime reporters, journalists, unions, and the police perspective. So everyone their own perspective. Basically, what's the first priority in terms of protecting journalists at the moment?
Tailor-made
Okay.
discussions
Yeah. Tailor-made, yeah.
I think
of solutions.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the moment where we are right now, I think we have to look at the prevention, and we're looking forward at the report that was promised already for this spring by the VODC. And in your report, I read that it's being postponed to next year or something. It's quite worrisome that, because we also have to look at what can we do at prevention, what is the intention of people who are attacking journalists, and what can we do ourselves. So I hope there's somebody from the Ministry of Justice here present, and we want to emphasize that this research should be available earlier than next year.
Yeah. Thank you. And Paye, last remark?
Yeah, for me, aside of what has been said, I think the network building, that's important. So that we know each other and we can frequently talk about the experiences.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. With these last 3 concrete recommendations, I think that's a good end note for this panel. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us here today, and everyone here in the room as well. Thank you for being here. If there are no further questions, I would like to round off and invite everyone for a drink at the bar after this. Thank you.